everyone to our monthly design conversation lecture series. We have one more to go on May 11th, so please come back. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to introduce our guest today. I've done all this research and put all this stuff together, but somehow I just want to kind of make it a more personal introduction, because it isn't very often that one has an opportunity to introduce a colleague that one admires so much. And that's really the case with our guest today. But for those of you that haven't read the poster, our guest is co-chair of the MFA Designer as author entrepreneur program and the SVA Master's Workshop in Rome at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Before, he was author of the visual column for the New York Times Book Review, and actually was, I think, art director for the New York Times Book Review for a long time. Paula Scher wrote the introduction, or the comments when Stephen Heller was given the AIGA Medalist Award, so I'm going to quote her just as a way of starting. Stephen Heller, the ubiquitous, tireless chronicler of our design times, is the author, co-author, or editor of more than, this time it was 60 books, but now it's up to 170 books on design. And it was my thought that I would bring in all of my 170 Stephen Heller books and have him sign them today. But I decided that it might be a bit much. It would kill you. It would kill you. But Paula Scher wrote, she said, "We easily take for granted our design history books, our magazines, and our conferences. We are accustomed now to seeing design work from all over the world and from any time in history without working terribly hard to find it. But before 1980, design books, magazines, and design conferences were few and far between. And our guest today really has immortalized our graphic past and made coherence of our present. The debt that future graphic designers owe him simply cannot be calculated, and I couldn't say it more appropriately. Welcome, Stephen Heller."
The funny thing is, I started more or less writing about design history after coming to Roger's second history symposium here at RIT. Before that, I was writing about cartoon and caricature and satiric art, political art. And it was Roger that really inspired me to move into this other area, because there were a lot of overlaps with the personnel who I was writing about. So Roger deserves much more of the credit than I do. I just happened to be obsessive and compulsive and wrote more books and ruined more forests. This is kind of like bringing coals to Newcastle, because this is this Vignelli Center and the library. These are the well springs of design history. The materials that are here, the shows that are put on, Roger's exemplary work. So what I'm going to talk about and show is really more about my own addiction to this field and how certain of these books have come about. Much of this will be known to you in the sense that some of the material is already here. In fact, in one particular project, some of the material came from here. But it is kind of like an autobiography of artifacting, creating a history. First, I'll just introduce myself. That's my son. And that's a tattoo he has on his back that was illustrated by Christoph Neumann, the great German illustrator. But how many of you have brothers, sisters, sons, or daughters who have tattoos of your puss on their back? When I heard he had done that, I was shocked. When I heard it was point and push, what's it called? Stick and push. Stick and bleed. Whatever it was, I was shocked, but now I'm quite honored. That was me as a young New York kid. We learned about weaponry early, so I immediately went to military school, where I was taught to be a killer. It didn't stick. I went to NYU and studied English, and I was thrown out for a reason I'll show you later. So I then went to the School of Visual Arts, where I was also thrown out, and 2 years later became a teacher in one of their master's programs, and 14 years after that started founding master's programs at SVA, and I've founded 5 or 6 of them, including the one I'm co-chair of. I worked for the left-wing underground press in the 60s, which was kind of my graduate school. It was also my undergraduate school. I didn't know much about design, but I did learn about communication and how to communicate a variety of messages. In this case, these are all but one plainclothes police officers who were agents provocateurs at anti-war rallies, who would take our photographs and put them in files. It was called the Red Squad. The guy sticking his tongue out, however, was not a cop. He was a photographer for the New York Daily News, and he was not happy to be put on the cover of our newspaper and sued us. The New York Free Press was a political paper that took its shots at New York government and New York establishment, but the only way we really were able to sell copies was when we put nudes on the cover. And many of our nudes came from this person. Does anybody know who she is? Yes. Who? Yayoi Kusama, who is now one of the leading artists in the world with 3 one-woman shows at different museums of modern art. And she would call me every week and say, "I got more photos for you." Out of that underground paper came something called Screw, which was the beginning of the sexual revolution in New York and probably in the United States. And this was something I designed. So for those of you who are graphic designers, ignore this completely. It's just a way to show that when you know nothing and you don't go to school for design, the results are knowing nothing and not going to school for design. However, from a political standpoint, it was very significant at the time. And I ultimately learned what typography was. I had gone off to some other papers. I learned by doing. When I was asked to go back to Screw a few years later, I suggested that they hire Pushpin Studios, Milton Glaser and Seymour Quast. And they did, but what Milton and Seymour did was put together a logo that was created out of Helvetica. And even then I knew that Helvetica was bad. Milton came up with the idea of the erect E. When he showed the layouts to us at the Pushpin office, which he still occupies, I put tissue paper over each layout and showed him what was wrong with it. I was just 18, and I was allowed to listen in on the telephone call between him and the publisher, him saying what an asshole I was. But a year later, I was able to airbrush the logo, and that's what you see here. But what I also did, because I had some political and legal savvy, was I started putting artwork on the covers. Took it out of the realm of pornography and made it into erotica. And so knowing that these publications would be busted by various local pornography laws and the overall Supreme Court decision that everything was community standards, I figured if I had artwork on the cover by people who worked for Time Magazine or Newsweek or the New York Times, we could call it socially responsible or socially viable. And that's what happened. I was busted twice and was in jail briefly twice, once when I was 17 and once when I was 18. And when Screw was busted by the feds for sending stuff through the mail, it was called pandering, I was able to be a hostile prosecution witness and show that each one of these issues had something that had social redeemability. And we won the case. My publication, the one that I started, was called the New York Review of Sex. I was more highbrow. That's me in the background wearing the tuxedo. And we did full color and we did it on paper. I still didn't really know how to design, but I knew how to order type from photo lettering, which in fact would not set our type because they said it was pornographic. So I had the letters set in a jumble and then pasted them all back together again. I was also art director for a magazine called Rock, and I was the first designer for Andy Warhol's Interview, where I should have learned that I was not a typographer because I put Broadway and Bussorama together as one typeface. And I worked for other underground papers around New York and around the country doing design and illustration. This was the East Village Other. This was something called the New York Ace. The East Village Other logo included an eye, and we were going head to head with the East Village Other, so we chopped the eye in half. And I actually designed that logo using Techno Pen and Compass and India ink. And it stinks, but it showed I had discipline. Back at Screw, we were doing other magazines, and one of them was called Mobster Times. And Mobster Times was supposed to be a magazine about political crime in the tradition of the satiric magazines like National Lampoon. For me, it was the first time I could work with really four-color process and play around with type a little more. So I designed this crappy logo, but I had a lot of fun playing with the R and putting the sights in the O. It lasted for 3 issues, and in our 3rd issue, we had the world's greatest criminal, the ears of so-and-so, the nose of so-and-so, the mouth of so-and-so, and you turn the page, and it was J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. He died that week, and the publisher, the distributor, Curtis Publishing, which was a national distributor, said, "We can't distribute this. This is too much." We were printed in a mafia-run printing house, and they didn't want to print it either because they called it commie crap. So they printed it at night when no one was looking. And no one really was looking because in the first edition, it was supposed to be a black cover with Al Capone's face on it. And one of our press people went out and saw a stack of them, and they were all gray. So I called up our mafia contact, and I said, "Sal, we have to get rid of these covers. They're not going to work. They're all gray." He said, "They're all right, Stevie. It's okay. Let me come get you." So he took me in his long white Cadillac out through the New Jersey wetlands, where he probably left many a friend, and brought me to this bindery, which was in the middle of nowhere. And he looked at the flat full of printed work, and he said, "Yeah, you're right. We stink." And he reprinted them, and the guy who was the pressman that particular night that this was running, I don't know what happened to him. Right after Screw, I got a job at the New York Times. I was the op-ed art director. I did that for 3 years, and at the same time, I started doing the New York Times Book Review, which I did for about 30 years. And what I loved about doing the book review is that A, it was the New York Times. B, I could use illustration. I loved illustration. I could use any illustrators. I could use my students. I could use anybody doing anything. And 3, I could pay homage to some of the icons that I most admired, including this fake cover of Sgt. Pepper that is about Clinton and his White House. And in this case, I used Chris Ware, the comic strip artist who is par excellence in this country. And not only did he change the masthead of the magazine, Book Review, into something totally different, he took the New York Times nameplate, which is sacrosanct, and he used the 1923 version of it, which I didn't even know until I was called in on the carpet by the managing editor and said, "You can never do this again." And I said, "But I've done it." And that was the end of that. But as I said at the outset, I'm an addict. And these are, thanks to my friend Seymour Quast, the drugs that I should be taking. Because if I don't take them, this is what I look like when I'm... And this used to be where I would keep my addictions. This particular room, this separate apartment, doesn't exist anymore, and 50% of the material is distributed elsewhere. But before we closed up, my son made a short film about it. Your archive is a lot nicer and better kept and kept. Now, this will all make sense to you in a few more minutes, but I'm going to ask a big favor of somebody. Can somebody sit in that third seat over there in the aisle? Thank you. It's just a little quirky thing, but you'll find out why. So what I'm addicted to are reference books and product mascots and mini mannequins and ads, tins, boxes, and displays, all things of popular and commercial culture. All kinds of ephemera that are printed and typographed and drawn. And all of these things are objects that kind of contribute to our history, at least in the West, of consumerism and of manipulation and of propaganda and all sorts of graphic and industrial design issues that we have to address on a daily basis that we kind of take for granted sometimes, or if we're studying it, we don't go that far back because it looks passé. I like going into the passé because it teaches me about the present. So for a while I was doing a lot of work uncovering how during the late 20s and early 30s, Art Deco was a means of communicating commercial messages and ultimately political messages as well to a populace in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. So these fans are part of that. How Art Deco was integrated as a style into everyday advertising, into catalogs, into magazines. These are things that are in fact very consciously and deliberately used to capture our collective imaginations. How some designers created packaging that captured our allure or had allure and captured our hearts and minds, and how even art movements like Cubism just were injected into the everyday, into the commonplace, that the avant-garde became the daily guard. And right here in this town, Eastman Kodak, before the orange and yellow logo was designed, they even used this kind of ersatz Mondrian for one, if not many, of their packages. And everything I do, everything you see is not just there because I have this sickness for the objects, but I have this fascination with the objects and they become books. So this happens to be the culmination of 6 of the 8 Art Deco books that my wife and I did on modern design. And this collects all of the European ones. I'm fascinated, as you saw in the video, with these 3-dimensional objects that I call sculptures of commerce. They're also called mini mannequins, they're also called cartons, they're also called display figures. Whatever you want to call them, they were used for selling things. And they sold everything from undergarments to overgarments to long johns to prosthetic devices. These were the things that on store counters or in store windows had a real effect on customers. And this one is the one my wife hates the most. So when we got rid of this apartment, this one came to my office, and now my co-chair hates it the most. But some of them are quite surreal. I mean, people design these things. They may have not signed their names to them. They may be anonymous to us now, but they were done by designers who learned design in some trade school or even some art school, or even were artists who did this on the side. And something like this Blatz beer advertisement comes straight out of surrealism. But also it was influenced by some other designers like Paul Rand. And some of the mannequins were modeled on real people, many on actresses and actors, and some on models that were hired specifically to become multiples. And some of them are just weird. And so they were also very carefully and precisely done. The mannequins that represented women's fashions the fashions are beautiful. My son says it's like playing with dolls. But there's something, the quality that was put into them is admirable, more than admirable, it's enviable. I mean, just look at this. This could be a real garment, but it's just yay tall. These I saved. And this represents the first one I ever got. I don't have the full-sized mannequin. He's about so high. But he's wearing Dufour long john underwear. He would have been in some sort of men's haberdashery. He's all silver. He has no arms. So he's like the long john Venus. And that became a book that Louise, my wife, and I did. Counterculture, the Allure of Mini Mannequins. And we actually had a photographer, a Times photographer, Tony Senecola, who lived in that apartment that you saw for 4 months, only being allowed out on weekends. And he photographed everything. And these are a few more of the items. They're random to a certain degree, but there are collections that are built around them, like the razor blades, which I still have, or hands that just, for me, they say something. Sometimes I don't know what they say. And sometimes I sit there and I start writing about them and all this gibberish comes out. But then I might interview somebody, like for Counterculture, I interviewed one of the people who made them, and it was just fascinating to hear his story, because everybody has a story to tell. Some people like to tell them. So that's the end of the confession. And now we go into the building of history, artifact by artifact. Everybody here has to be in love with type, right? You got to be, you know, how many typefaces can you fit on the end of a pin, that kind of thing. If you're a designer, type is your lingua franca, and it doesn't matter where the type comes from. We're exposed, the world now is exposed to type on the computer, but type used to be the province of specific people, of tradesmen, craftsmen, apprentices that took years to apprentice, lithographers, printers. I feel it's important to chronicle all the type that can be found in all the different manifestations of it, and try to explain it in some fashion. Why serifs worked, why sans serif types came about, why shadow types came about, and you'll see what I did with them. So this is just some of the stuff that I have. And this was based on a book I did, and it's a little film that a student of mine did. So the book is Typology, and it is essentially a timeline of typographic styles, not of body type, not of neutral type, but of expressive, emotive, and display types. And not all of them, because there are so many. But it does take you through the different eras of typography, as that film so beautifully did. I mean, it was like a gift to me from the student who did it. And I just love what type says, in addition to how it says things. So I just finished a book that's just come out, co-authored with Gail Anderson, called Type Tells Tales. And it's about books that use type as the content of the book, of illustrated type. Roger told me there's now a pretty good collection of avant-garde typography in the library. This begins with the avant-garde typography that was used as an expression of sound and feeling and emotion, and goes into the 21st century uses of it as well. Another area of type that I'm quite fascinated by, if not fetished by, is shadow type. I think that the idea of adding dimension to type is really a radical concept. It goes back to the days of inscriptions where the type, in epigraphy, the type goes into the stone and it doesn't rise above the stone, but it's the same concept. It's giving lettering a dimension. And the lettering with dimension is there to raise the awareness of that type in different lights and in different shades. And when three-dimensional type or shadow type was used in printing material, it was to have it jump off the page, to give it that third dimension, or to illuminate something before neon, before light bulbs. So I started collecting a large amount of shadow type in various forms and from various countries. And for various reasons, they existed, as I said, to show dimension. They existed to identify one company from another in a more demonstrative manner. They were used for fun. And shadow type became a book. And it became part of a series that Louise and I call the S series. And it's because there are 4 books in this series, and they all start with S's. It was purely accidental. The first one was scripts. The second one was shadow. The third one was stencil. And the fourth one was slab. And they asked if we'd do a 5th one, and I didn't want to do sans. And speaking of stencil, we often think about the revolution in movable type with Gutenberg and the Bible and using black letter in metal form. But really, one of the earliest forms of typographic manufacture was the stencil. It didn't move, but it expressed. And so I started collecting very old stencils to show the beauty and the craft of making these amazing pieces that, in this case, in these last 2 cases and more, have existed for over 100 years because they were done on oak tag or something like that paper. And they're not as pristine as you would like to see on using Fontographer, or any real type designer would retch at the sight of these. But they say something. They have a personality. And they have an intrinsic value in our history of design. Stencil type also has a long history. It's not just something that was used to identify bushels of tobacco or bushels of cotton or lamp posts where a number of a street had to be made, or like in Venice, the street signs were done in stencil. It was considered an industrial type as well, because, actually I'm not sure why but this was an avant-garde magazine called Broom, which was a very peripatetic magazine. It went from New York to Paris, throughout Europe, and stencil type was made specifically for the magazine. We know stencil because it's functional in things like wet paint. And if you were my age, or maybe even a little younger, you might have learned your typographic ABCs by using stencil lettering, particularly to title your book reports. And the woman who created this, along with her brother, was a Baltimore school teacher, and she made a fortune doing this in numerous languages and numerous type styles. And even Paul Rand used stencil type. So here's my big question for all of you, any of you. Why did Paul Rand use stencil for El Producto? I gave the clue away before. Say it louder and prouder.
To mimic its use in tobacco production on the bags.
Exactly. Totally. And he never told anybody that. He just showed it to them, and they bought it. Here's Portfolio magazine, Alexei Brodovich, using it as a decorative form. And here's Paul Rand again, using it as a logo for an automobile company that didn't quite make it. And this is the book for which one of Louise's designers actually made a stencil. This is stencil type by Fernand Léger, the painter and printmaker, but it's for a totally different collection that became a book, an exhibition for me. Avant-garde magazines of the 20th century, which were the internet of their day. This is Vendigen, a Dutch architectural magazine produced by a man named Thomas Wiedeweld. There were 120 or so issues of this. Each one had a different cover, but each was bound in this Japanese manner. And each one introduced to the world, but his world, the world of the avant-garde artist, a particular architect or graphic designer or interior designer. This is Het Overzicht, which was a Flemish design or art magazine. This was all done as one woodcut. Jedermann sein eigener Fußball, Every Man His Own Football, was the first political, well, not the first political magazine, but it was one of the first political Dada magazines. And John Hartfield, who was the designer of the magazine, included his own photo montage, which was the first time photo montage was used in a political fashion. This one is Integral, which was Romanian. Every country had at least one avant-garde magazine representing that particular kind of art. And this was made out of type pieces, or what would be called furniture. This one was Polish, block, and frankly, it looks like it could have been done yesterday. And it became this book, Marriage to Emigre and Beyond, Avant-Garde Magazine Design of the 20th Century. It wasn't the title that I wanted to use. I wanted to use the word unacceptable, but the publisher didn't think it would work. So now I have to say Marriage to Emigre and Beyond, Avant-Garde Magazine of the 20th Century all the time. Another magazine. Since I grew up doing magazines, I have a great fondness for magazines. And one of the ways that graphic design history can be best explored today by scholars today is through the design magazines that were specifically made for graphic designers, commercial artists, poster artists, advertising artists, and the like. Das Plakat was one of the great ones. And all the covers were different, all the logos were different. There was no standard design. Inside, there were the usual number of columns, but each issue had its own content, different kinds of content, and today stands as a document of design. So you'd see work like this tipped in or printed. Different designers made their own design magazines. This one called Das Zelt, the tent, was made by F.H. Emke, who was a logo designer. This one is called De Reclame, which means advertising. And this happens to be a Dutch version, but there was also a German Reclame, there was a Russian Reclame. These were magazines that also appeared in every country that had an industry, because this was a way of allowing designers to see what was going on elsewhere before the internet. And it made a point of saying, this is how you can do it. So this was a magazine that you copied from. But Reklama wasn't just one particular style, it was a number of styles. So there was this streamlined approach, and then there was this cubistic approach. And then there was a Reklama in Czechoslovakia right after World War II, when the Soviets were basically running the country, and there wasn't that much to sell to begin with, but there was still a consumer, there was still industry. There's still beer and paint and stuff. So this is a Reklama, and this is a Reklama from that period of time. And it still has a certain amount of flair to it, but it's more austere than the Deco period. And that became a book called 100 Classic Graphic Design Journals, which I would have called something else as well. But I love the cover. And also in writing and creating history, as Roger will tell you, and Roger has done with 9 Pioneers and his book on Lester Beale and others, you have to get to know the people who've made the history, because basically they didn't know they were making history. For many years, I wrote obituaries for the New York Times on designers, and it was my contribution to the legacy, to get the New York Times to acknowledge that there were many people who would go unacknowledged, who were part of our world, our community. And I got to be friends with a number of the people I ultimately had to write obituaries about, and I got to know the families of many people whose obituaries I would have written had I known them, had I been around when they were around. Paul Rand is one of them, and here's just a little clip from the second to last interview he ever did.
And you know, I still look admiringly at the collages of Brock and Picasso, just pieces of newspapers and lines of charcoal, and I try to figure out, why does this stuff look so terrific even today? I mean, I don't know why.
I'm the good-looking one.
Sense of freedom,
I don't know why.
At the time you were working, there were a number of definitions of modernism in the United States. And I want to read you one, and maybe you'd like to comment. This is by Ernst Elmo Calkins, who was the, shall we say, inventor of forced obsolescence in advertising, who brought a modernistic sensibility to graphic design. And he said, modernism, or what is conceived to be modernism, has profoundly influenced an American advertising design in both the pictorial treatment and the typography. A good deal that is merely eccentric, the attempt to be different, is wrongly classed as modernism. But principally, the movement is an effort to shake off the old realistic treatment, which has reached such a dead level of excellence in still life painting as to render it difficult to give an advertisement by the old methods the distinction and individuality it should have, which is essentially what you've been saying.
Yeah, I'm amazed to, I mean, this Calkins was an old, when I say old, even at the time when I was a kid, he was already old. He was the head of an advertising agency, Ernest Elmo Calkins. And he was sort of, I don't know how much, I'm astonished to hear that he was so clear about this.
Well, he goes.
So Rand was one of the few that brought European modernism to American advertising and ultimately to American design. When he did El Producto, he was working at a boutique agency called the Weintraub Agency. In those days, the white shoe agencies were run by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and that was the dominant structure. And there were a few agencies that were run by ethnics, either Italians or Jews. And there were very few black agencies. There was one in Chicago. And Rand was the art director and oversaw a large bullpen of people, but he did most of his own work and he signed it all. And one of the things he became very well known for was doing serial advertising, not for cereal packages, but every week there would be a story that was a contiguous story being told. So in the El Producto case, the cigars became the characters and they would tell stories. He also did book jackets. He was a Renaissance designer. And some of his book jackets are just timeless by my standards. And of course, in the early 1950s, he started doing corporate work. And he entered the realm of IBM thanks to Elliott Noyes. And Rand had an instinctual sense of what was appropriate and what was inappropriate. IBM originally had a logo that was part of a globe, and then it moved to another logo that was stymie type, which was slab serif, but very 19th century. And IBM was trying to be a business machine company that was very 20th century. So what Rand did was he took George Trump's typeface called City Bold, which was designed a few decades before, but still had a modern sensibility while keeping the slab serif, and used that, and introduced color. And his rationale for doing that was you cannot change a logo too radically or you'll lose your customer base. You have to retain a good part of what was original and then make incremental changes. So he didn't even add these scan lines for another 5 or 6 years, maybe more, after he changed the logo, because it would have been too radical a shift. He was often asked why the scan lines were used, and he'd joke about it. People would say that it had to do with the scan lines on a check, but basically it was a very functional development for him. He did it in 2 different weights so that when the logos were used, they wouldn't be so bold and in your face, that they could be more in the background and blend into the advertising. He also did the Westinghouse logo. Westinghouse already had a W, it already had a lozenge underneath it. So basically what he did was he added the schematic quality to it. And he gave the rough that he did to Elliott Noyes to show to the board of directors. And different people came up with different reasons for why they didn't like it. It looked like a clown, or it looked like a king wearing a crown. The lozenge looked too much like a mouth. Ultimately, the chief of the board said it works. And that was the only thing Rand was going to show. And it became the logo. And it's the logo today. And only Rand was able to play with his logos. He was the keeper of the flame, he was the keeper of the logos, and he could do with them what he wanted, but he would set up study centers where designers who worked on these things learned the right way and the wrong way of playing with the identity. So for me, when Rand passed away after we were friends for well over a decade, and we joke around a lot together. I was asked by Phaidon to do a biography of him, and I realized I could not do a life biography on him. I just didn't want to devote that much of my life to his life. What's more, there were things he told me in confidence that I just wouldn't and couldn't put on paper. So I did a professional biography, and that's what exists today. Roger and I were talking earlier about Fred Troller, a wonderful Swiss designer who came here and did Geigy work, pharmaceutical work. He was asked by Rand to design his headstone when he died. Rand was actually doing a logo for the hospital he was in up to the moment that he died. But the one great story about this particular logo, this particular tombstone, which I visited in Connecticut, and it's on the side of a little incline, a hill or a berm. In Jewish culture, when you go to a cemetery, you leave a rock on the tombstone to show you've been there, because your mother wants to know you were there. Rand didn't want any old crummy rock, so he stipulated that at the base of his tombstone there be polished stones. So that's what's there. Another let's say, hero of mine in the modernist movement was Alvin Lustig. I got to know his widow as Roger knew her. She just died a few months ago, Elaine Lustig Cohen. She was a designer in her own right, and my next book that's coming out is dedicated to her. He died when he was 45 years old of infantile diabetes. So I figured I could write about him and it wouldn't be that long. I wouldn't have to take that much time, because he died when he was 45. How much work did I have to talk about? I could talk about his book jackets, which were based on art models, the models of Paul Klee and many of the abstract expressionists, including Mark Rothko, who he was very fond of. I could write about how he changed his style on a regular basis because he wanted to push the form in as many different ways as possible, using photography as well as graphics. I could write about how he brought back a certain kind of retro that designers are using today, and using vintage type. And I could talk about how he also worked in a minimalist way, using different typefaces and colors that were not usual for book jackets, and how he also created a way of selling books that was unusual or unique in retail book selling, because everything was shown by a spine in the old days. They weren't flat out on the table. He designed books that had to be flat to be seen, because the spines were irrelevant. A lot of designers worked on the spines as much as they worked on the covers. And as I said, he was 45 when he died, and he was blind for a year and a half before he died. So his wife, Elaine,
and when Alvin lost his sight, I mean, because he trained me so well, I was there to interpret. And the people in the office, Dick wasn't there at that time, but we had all, become so familiar with this that he would dictate what he wanted. We don't really know whether we did what he wanted. I mean, we probably worked in a little bit of what we wanted, but in the last year and a half to year before he died, he had really lost his sight. And, but he would, tell us, go down a pike and over 3 pikes and how high the type should be and how thick the stripe should be and what the color should be. And then he would use references to painters, like the kind of colors so-and-so would use, or the kind of... But by that time, they were very simple designs.
So what I didn't realize was he started working when he was a teenager. He was setting type. He was living on the West Coast where there weren't that many graphic designers, and he was truly in the modernist spirit in terms of the kinds of things he did, collage and angular work and using sans serif typography, that he was very involved in the magazine world in New York with Cowles publications, as well as Whitney publications, where he did industrial design, and this was one of the covers that he did, which is such a modernist classic now. He even did this cover, which is, for me, the most beautiful magazine cover ever designed for Fortune. There's not a cover line on it. You have absolutely no idea what's in the issue, and you don't have to know because you just want the issue. And he taught as well. He taught at Black Mountain College and at Yale. But he was also so incredibly curious and inventive that he worked as an industrial designer. He created this helicopter, which I wouldn't go up in a million years in. But he did it for, I can't remember the name now, but one of his clients who ran a sound company. And it's very much similar to the chairs that he designed, or the one chair that he designed. And this is a Gorgi Kepish montage, but he designed furniture, and the furniture was in the modern tradition. This was his studio at Look magazine. And he was an architect, but he didn't have an architectural degree or an architectural license. So he worked with an architect who did all the plans and got them filed, but he designed the Beverly Landau Hotel. And it became this book that Elaine and I did together, The Life and Work of Alvin Lustig. I wrote it, did as much research as I could, but Elaine really had the collection, and it was wonderful to spend time with her and go through all the material. And her daughter, Tamar, designed the book. This is the book I'm just finished, have just finished. I've done it with Greg D'Onofrio. Some of the material in this book has actually come from the RIT archive. It's called The Moderns, and I'll just tell you two things about it, and then go through a few of the pages. For the longest time, I was anti-modern in the sense that the kind of work that Massimo did, the kind of work that Rudy de Harrick did, the kind of work that's celebrated here, didn't appeal to me. It was so formal. It felt rote, it felt generic, it felt geometric, it felt like there was too much theory behind it. And I was looking for things that had style and flair and emotion. And I was very nearsighted. I was more a pushpin person than I was a modern person. Then all of a sudden, I did a story on Rudy de Harrick, and I realized, you know, it's like any kid who's starting out doesn't really want to look at old art director annuals because they'll think they're going to be inspired by something and they'll copy it. I don't know whether this has ever happened to you, but it certainly happened to me, where if I saw something else, I would immediately do it, and I'd slap myself silly because I shouldn't be doing that. I should be original. So I didn't really look at the thing that became my nemesis until I started writing about it. And at a certain point, I realized that, as Roger knows, and as you probably all know, there's more of a movement than a sterility. There's a movement of people working within a similar language, but not doing the exact same thing. And so there were designers who I found whose work I really was interested in, like in this case, Roy Kuhlman, who was working in the vocabulary of modernism, but it didn't seem like the stereotype of modernism. It wasn't Helvetica per se. And I happened to be an art director at Evergreen at one point, and I always loved Roy Kuhlman's work. And I started seeing other people that were doing things that you could put together. You could make a taxonomy of these people. They worked with geometry, they worked with overlapping colors, they worked with paint at times, they worked with photography, codoliths. So George Giusti fell into that category as well, and I always loved his book jackets, even when I was in high school. This is actually my copy from when I was in high school, reading Albert Camus. Or Matthew Leibowitz doing using classical imagery along with this kind of modernist free forms sensibility. Or Walter Allner, who was an art director at Fortune, but also did many of its covers, using very strict planes and lines to establish. This is Charles Murphy, who was the art director of Command Records, which was a wellspring of modernist design, including design by Joseph Albers. And all of a sudden, this semi-abstraction, this shape and form, started to appeal to me, particularly when type was added. And I could see that I was just denying myself an entire realm of work. I had done a couple of articles on Eric Nietzsche. There was a certain aspect of his work I knew, but I didn't know that he had worked in this kind of abstraction. And George Cherney, who is a big part of the School of Visual Arts, I didn't realize to the extent he was doing this groundbreaking kind of graphics. And even Deborah Sussman, who studied at the American Bauhaus and was a modernist, went off into this kind of superannuated modernism, this carnival modernism. So the book includes emigres, like Joseph Albers, like George Giusti. And then there's a whole section on homegrowns, like Lester Beale, Robert Brownjohn, Rudy DeHarrick. I mean, these are all things that I look at now with not just fondness, but true admiration. Lillian Baseman, just coincidentally, Lillian Baseman, she's one of 5 or 6 women in a book of 60 designers, because there weren't that many women working where their names were seen and heard. Lillian Baseman is the mother of my editor on the book. So, we won't go from Lillian Baseman to something truly obscene. Swastika. I told you I'm interested in politics, I'm interested in signs and symbols, and I'm interested in how signs and symbols are integrated into politics. This is not political, this is a swastika with Coca-Cola, because the swastika is one of the oldest symbols in history, and it represented fertility and good luck, the 4 seasons. It represented a lot of things, but it also represented the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazis. And I was interested in finding its origins, finding its roots, finding how it was perverted and whether it should stay perverted. The Girls Club used it as their own emblem. They had their own magazine, but it's still used by white supremacists, and unfortunately in our current political climate, it's coming back again. Just yesterday they announced on the radio in New York that anti-Semitic crimes have risen considerably in the city. And there are people throughout the world that use the swastika in a really weird way. This is a food shop in Thailand. And even when it's used as a symbol of negativity, of criminality, as in this Don't Smoke poster, it still has this horrible effect. So I did a book called The Symbol Beyond Redemption with a question mark at the end. And every so often the question mark comes off, and then it always goes back on again. And in the last 2 months, I've had 5 interviews, magazine interviews, with people asking me about the swastika from national magazines and radio, because they see a resurgence throughout the world. From there, I became quite interested in how dictatorships propagated themselves through graphic design. So I wanted to see how branding worked with Hitler, Mao, Mussolini, and Lenin. So I created a huge collection of materials, which is not that difficult to do because they're still around and because these regimes created tons of graphic materials and employed many, many graphic designers to perpetuate their propaganda and their faith. Propaganda means perpetuation of the faith, and it started as a religious term under Pope Gregory, propagation of the faith. So Mussolini's face became godlike. Hitler's face was the ultimate, the extreme leader. Mao allowed himself to be deified as well. Lenin, although not in a militaristic garb and more intellectual in many ways, was also the quintessential modern dictator. And he was celebrated by modern artists, the avant-garde in Russia, until Stalin came along and he... Shut up. He became the adversary of the avant-garde. He wiped it out, basically, and instituted socialist realism. I was also fascinated on how children's minds were usurped by these regimes, and how to get into somebody's mind, you go in as early as possible. So this happens to be a kid who is part of the fascist Vanguardista. He's carrying a baton because that's what they use to beat up their enemies. And he's smoking a cigarette because actually cigarette companies sold cigarettes to kids under the banner of fascism. While girls and women were not first-class citizens in fascist Italy, they still served a purpose, like to take care of kids and make children. So they created a typographic language that would appeal to kids. And this is an Art Deco language that's rooted in futurism that had that appeal. In Germany, the children were part of the Hitler Youth going to age 6 and upward. In China, the Red Guard had the little red book and their armbands that supported Mao Zedong. And in Russia, there were the young pioneers who at first were kind of embraced by the avant-garde and then became more traditional. I was also very interested in the whole idea of uniformity. And uniformity not only in the way things looked in the physical world, but what you wore. Uniforms told a great story, and they still tell a fantastic story. I happen to have known the man who designed these for Mussolini. His name was Paolo Goretto, and he later recanted, and ultimately, basically, he was put on Mussolini's bodyguard detachment, and he learned that it was a position that he had to hold for life, so he got out. And I was also, and am still also, interested in other symbols that are physical manifestations. So the Roman salute, or the Nazi salute, is as graphic as anything. And this happens to be a book about how to salute the right way and the wrong way.
Leaflets, pamphlets, books, an avalanche of words and promises. The German nothing before. So Hitler gives out uniforms. Uniforms for everyone. Uniforms for boys, uniforms for girls, for Germans, for motorists, for whole factories are made up of manufacturing Nazi uniforms.
And so that became the book Iron Fists, Branding the 20th Century Totalitarian State. And that's where they let me use my own title. And there are still people who believe this stuff. And unfortunately, they're growing in number throughout Europe, and they're coming above ground in the United States. This is from Greece. This is from Switzerland. And this is ultimately what happens when you let this crap happen. Another thing that has always interested me, and it's the one book that, well, it's not the one book, but it's one of the books that I was never able to finish because I just got too emotionally involved in it. And it's about how graphic designers support racism and how products underscore racist beliefs. And this, I won't ask you why it's racist. I'll tell you. It's called skin color. So this is the dominant skin color. Native Americans were used as brand characters. Their likenesses were sometimes caricatured. Even their language was caricatured. Asians were always considered threats. There was a long period of time when Chinese were not allowed in this country. There was a big ban, and then of course with the Japanese, they became demonized because we were at war with them. Jews were not welcome either, particularly Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jews. They were made fun of in the press. Puck's library was a very popular journal. The Puck Building, which is owned by Jared Kushner in New York, is where this was published. Little Black Sambo started out as an Indian in the Southeast Asia, publication and then translated into America as a little black African. And this is what's called incidental racism, these kind of minstrel-like characters being used to sell a game. Or in this case, these so-called pygmies used to sell gold dust cleaning products, which when I was a kid, as old as 10 or 12, it was still out there in the marketplace. And this cream of wheat is still in the marketplace. And we're getting to the end. Because I grew up during the Cold War, I was always afraid of not waking up one morning because of this. Because this kind of literature, and designers had something to do with it, was handed out at post offices, given to us at school. We had drills every week. And basically, we were brought up in an atmosphere of fear that unless we as a nation did one thing, the Soviets as a nation would do another thing, and it would come to no good. And there were magazine articles in some of the greatest magazines. This magazine was redesigned by Herb Lubalin, but this image was probably not one of his. There were some dissenters in the graphic design industry. They belonged to a group called SANE. This was the first time the atomic bomb was used as a symbol of death by Robert Osborne, who was a modernist illustrator. And this is Ben Shawn doing one of the many posters that SANE produced that I'm not showing you. And that became Red Scared, the Commie Menace in Propaganda and Popular Culture. I also just like to collect things that have irony. Saddam has gas. That's not funny to you? Or where bad design is used to make life even worse. You know, design can make things better for people, but this Homeland Security advisory system is pretty crappy design.
You blew it up! Damn you! God damn you all to hell!
My favorite movie with my least favorite actor. But it makes a point. And I'm just going to quickly go through this. I have a book out now called Rants and Raves, which is a collection of essays which include essays on propaganda and other things that are used in contemporary culture. And this is a co-option of the Joe Camel advertising from the 70s. This was a cover that was never run by George Lois, who did over 100 covers for Esquire magazine. Many of them were quite political, but this one didn't quite make it. I'm also fascinated by how the Germans, prior to World War II, created very powerful book design, and this was designed by John Hartfield. I'm interested in how letters tell us certain stories, so this was a story that I wrote in print on X being X-rated. And I'm interested in the way women were treated on both sides of the divide, that there was either the housewife or the vamp and nothing in between for an awful long time. And I'm interested in how something as banal as this could have won an election. And so I've been getting on a soapbox of late. And that's the book Rants and Raves. Now, that's the end. These are some of my co-authors. And this is my end slide. But under one of your seats is a Vignelli button, and whoever has it gets this. Oh my goodness, what a surprise. Yeah, you keep the button. So thank you very much.